among them the cultural rights, which are the tools to bridge the gaps for always all the library sector. And I would like to thank Claire, whom I'm about to introduce, and Shannon. I would like to thank IFLA for accompanying us, because for us it's like the mother figure, accompanying us and always boosting this kind of advocacy work, which is what we are here to do, to make the voices heard of the libraries and the transformation stakeholders that guarantee cultural rights. There is another thing that we would like to do, which is to think about the future. And the questions that we are about to introduce have to do with looking for the future. And we have the objective culture document that has been published, where libraries have a lot to contribute to. So we're going to talk about the goals, the targets that we want to head for in order to achieve that culture goal, so that it's acknowledged as an objective on its own, and in order to achieve the targets and goals we want to pursue. So without further ado, I'm accompanied at the table by Asun Maestro. I don't have her review, so what do I do in order to introduce you? Well, I wouldn't know what to say about her other than she's a librarian that we have been working on activism in the library field for many years, that we met many years ago. She from Asnavi and I from the Librarians Association of Valencia in the framework of CESAVI. Obviously, and she has been working really well for the network of libraries from Navarra that she has recently retired from. And we're also accompanied by Claire McGuire, who is the Manager of Policy and Advocacy at IFLA. She is in charge of coordinating all the work of IFLA with other organizations like UNESCO, and she's especially working in integrating the perspective of the impact from libraries in other policies. And the truth is that we already know this campaign, such as this bell button that come from IFLA, and all the work that we have done and that Claire's team is doing. And we also have Ana Calvete is coming from CGLU, from the United Local Governments and Cities organization. It's a discovery for me for a couple of years, but it's an institution that has been working with local governments and who have placed a bet on culture in local policies, generating a plethora of really interesting documents. And Anna's work is devoted to research, mainly, and conducting research on those policies in order to come up with proposals towards that future. Policies and governance models, including cultural rights. So, if you agree, let me begin with Asun, because Asun has been part of the working group of libraries and Agenda 2030 that we had in the Librarian Council for Cooperation. And I would like for you, Asun, briefly, well, I'm going to try to moderate the brief part. I would like for you to talk about this background and all the trajectory, all the path that we have walked in order to pursue the outlook of Sustainable Development Goals from the perspective of culture and what we have done from the Council of Cooperation of Libraries. Okay, so let's begin. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to welcome you. I'm going to try to be brief and go straight to the point. You have a question, but then I will, deviate from that, as you know. We are establishing an international dialogue in order to unleash culture for the sake of sustainable development. And if we unleash the cultural power, we need to couple that to the power of libraries, which is something we believe in. You haven't defined libraries, and we come from fundamental doctrine, so I'm going to introduce a small definition. I would like to say that a library is a live being available for anyone, and which is an engine of transformation for societies and people, which is a mixture of Maria Moliner's doctrine and Ranganatal's approach and the manifesto from the UNESCO. And we couple this with the word transformation. The manifesto of IFLA UNESCO of 2022, which has been reviewed, has been a very valuable doctrine tool in order to focus this discussion of what we have been doing from the practice. And with this idea of libraries and all the passion that we have, we started working in this group in 2018. Curiously enough, these texts date from afterwards, and we were, excuse my pronunciation in English, but this is part of the advocacy program, which is standing for what you truly believe in, really. And in IFLA, it was called the International Advocacy Program at IFLA. And Cesavi translated that, and I love to see Xavier, the president, here, and Gloria Perez Salmerón. For many of us, you are part of you're not part of the doctrine, but you are a reference, together with Alicia, who back then was also there. So this IFLA movement, in order to raise awareness among librarians, gave us another keyword in this realm, which is cooperation and alliances, first with ourselves in all the workshops that were organized and in many communities that have organized this event that Alicia quoted, and I'm going to quote Navarra, Galicia, Extremadura, and the Canary Islands. You're seeing images. No, not anymore. Okay. We had the streaming of images of libraries that were well known, and they were really similar in other territories. But we wanted to value also another milestone in this path regarding how even politicians can work in this field, and not only associations and professional associations. And as director of the librarian services, it has been an honor to have a library system with which we could show evidence of many things we stood for. I'm going to make 3 points. We wanted to render the actions or the contribution of library more visible. We wanted to document ourselves regarding the strategy of transformation towards a more sustainable world on the 2030 agenda. We wanted to gather best practices, which is a word I despise ever more. We need to look for a different one, really, because when you think about best practices, you think about ad hoc activities. When we are trying to have a global strategy, well, maybe global is not the right word because it's too aspirational. Okay, systemic. We were looking for something more systemic. That's correct. That was the right word. Thank you. So there's something that I would like to convey to you that is something that gives me satisfaction, which is something rare. We were working in this group, and we wanted for libraries, which have their own library policy, which is based on poetics, on poetry. We wanted to place them in the political agenda. The biggest achievement that we have seen is the inclusion of the libraries in the political agenda. Otherwise, this wouldn't have been convened by Director General, as we see. And thank you very much for your attendance. Director General and representatives from Barcelona, which boasts an evident potential for libraries. So this combination of these policies is one of the achievements. The administration has the opportunity, and it has been unveiled in many areas, to make certain public policies visible in the libraries, the knowledge of the 2030 agenda, for example, and to exercise public policies such as using libraries as digital capacity building centers, give visibility and raise awareness in libraries on health campaigns. I'm talking about Navarra because it's what I know, but I know that there's other communities where you can find some other examples. And we have been documenting all of that because data are fundamental. Alicia loves this, and I love to say that data are mainly arguments. If you have data, you can justify, you can back up why libraries need to be included in the policy that we want. Okay, is that okay? Okay, and this is linked to the second question that I wanted to pose. In addition to the path that you have done and which has made us reflect on something more systemic rather than best practices and to be able to show the impact and the value of libraries, I would like for you to reflect on something else. Navarra is one example, but I would like for you to give us examples of the involvement of libraries in the development strategy. How have libraries appeared in the follow-up examinations? Because it's not just enough to say that libraries contribute and that we tell the tale, but also how are they rendered visible in the voluntary follow-up or monitoring exams which are conducted to the communities and the country, and whether this is helping reinforce the library systems and networks? I am sure that that's the case. Maybe I'm talking too much about Navarra, but it's what I'm familiar with, and it's just like the heritage that we were listening about. All communities have treasures, and when you talk about your own treasure, well, you take pride. Navarra was fortunate enough for one decade that the libraries have been placed within the political agenda, because in the building of the 2030 agenda, libraries were taken into consideration, and then the library activities have been reflected in two reports, voluntary reports drafted in 21 and 24. And it has been present in cross-sectional policies such as accessibility, digital capacity building for the citizenship, awareness-raising campaigns in the realm of health, and the language. And then we have talked about rurality and the population. Our work is contributing for the effectiveness of those policies. Let me give you a couple of examples. This one is key. Allow me. It's not cause-effect, but I believe that all this work that we have been doing from the Council, from the communities and libraries, in a non-systemic way, but drop by drop, for example, in terms of mobile libraries, we have reached the realm of public policy. In the last 5 years, in Navarra, we boast a flotilla, we could say a fleet of vehicles and mobile libraries. Cantabria, Galicia also have mobile units. The Canary Islands, which I loved, Antonio. You have the biblioguagua, which is a word used in the Canary Islands to talk about a bus. It was only for the summertime, but okay, it's good. And Catalonia, it was always a reference. Your mobile library system was always a reference. You're revising, renewing, and looking into smaller vehicles in order to reach even remoter areas. So I think that's the most palpable, tangible example of how the poetry and all the passion and all the library public policy has been translated into practice. We have achieved a cross-sectionality. And in the voluntary exams in Navarra, in addition to the library bus, in the exam of 2021, there is another example linked to sustainability. In 2024, the seed library was not invented by Navarra, but it has achieved an acknowledgement. I learned from the Medellin Seed Library, and I should quote it. The seeds libraries are an example of how this is pivoting around the idea of the library and the cultural root of the culture, and agriculture is linked and intertwined, and the presence in the community, which is really important. And this is one of the strengths that has been reinforced and the manifesto, because it went further, some additional mile. They're not just talking about two children, but the whole citizenship. It's a universal and proximity service. And this example of activity, which might seem foolish, well, to have a cupboard of seeds and chickpea, I don't know what's the reason why peas are all the rage right now. And this is generating a lot of activity in the villages, gatherings of people, in addition to the exchange of seeds, a whole culture generated around this movement, and an experience which goes beyond the realm of libraries per se, and it reaches the community. And let me end up by saying that the 2030 agenda has a poetic motto, which is to leave no one behind. And this is what libraries are all about. And that's the context. I don't know whether I answered your question, because but it's the importance of making what we do visible in the political documents, where they're added to the indicators, which at the end of the day are going to measure the impact and the degree of achievement of goals in the different countries. Now, let me ask Claire. Asun has mentioned that IFLA, for many years, is playing a very important role in the defense of libraries as key stakeholders in development and transformation of communities. I bring this where stories happen. Sometimes I have the accelerators of development logo, or motto rather, from IFLA. But Claire, with an international global view, later on I'm going to talk about something more practical, but from a global perspective, in your opinion, Claire, which is the position of libraries in the political agenda? Which are the priorities of IFLA to place libraries, and in which policies? What are you working on right now?
Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes, todos y todas. I'm going to speak in English. I'm sorry for that. It's wonderful to hear that IFLA has helped kind of accelerate this. And for many years, I have to say, today is IFLA's 98th birthday. So, wow. You know, and here's to another 98. And we place libraries as being truly at the intersection of so many policy areas. They're cultural institutions, they're centers of lifelong learning, centers of democracy. They hold the memory of our communities, of our countries. They champion the right of access to information and the freedom of expression. This underpins everything. And this was really in the 2022 IFLA UNESCO School Public Library Manifesto, this year in the IFLA UNESCO School Library Manifesto. And we really believe our sector has a role to play in sustainable development across the agenda. And we see, when we look through voluntary national reporting, we've just published an overview yesterday of the 2025 reporting as it pertains to knowledge and information. And it is well understood by countries that access to knowledge and information have a critical role to play. And whether they're connecting libraries there, in some cases they are, there's also an action for us, but it is well understood. And across the political agenda, especially in the pillars of sustainable development, so social, economic, environmental, and cultural, libraries can be an implementation partner, but we're not just implementing. Library professionals are also very proactive. Our profession has some of the strongest human rights advocates. championing intellectual freedom, pushing back against trends, against censorship, book banning, closing information behind paywalls. And so when we look at what we prioritize at IFLA within sustainable development, we're really looking in some really interesting areas. And I love that you brought up the seed libraries and the environment, because we're looking at the role of culture and cultural institutions like libraries in lifelong and community-wide climate empowerment. So that is education, but also access to information, participation on how can we understand the climate and what can we do? And that's been a big focus of our work, also in the UN with the UNFCCC. We all know that the information landscape is changing, the way people access information, use it, share it, create it. And libraries have adapted. Libraries have always adapted to the changing information landscape. So we recognize we're in this moment of change. Emerging technologies, AI has the power to enhance our work, but there's also a lot of questions, right? So we're looking at how we ensure that library and information professionals are also at the table when these discussions are being had, that it's not just technology companies, but this also takes support for upskilling and learning. So that's another area we're keen to look at. And we're really passionate about human rights and firmly placing libraries in the heart of defending cultural rights. And this informs a lot of what IFLA does. It informs a lot of what you're all doing in your libraries. And we're really looking across all the areas we work, all the different political areas we work, to make sure that cultural rights, human rights focus about access, about participation is there at the heart.
Es muy interesante como estabas
Really
acabando, porque
interesting how you wrap this up, because the idea of the legal framework in the libraries, or the majority of the normative documents, always talk about, and that's the title of the panel, they have always talked about access, but libraries are access and cultural participation. We would like to insist also on this point. And now, specifically speaking, I would like to discuss the key matters, and how do you consider these key topics from IFLA to reinforce libraries as proximity service, a close service for cultural policies? One of the presentations that you made regarding the culture objective, well, there was a question of which are the priorities to be considered by the ministries for culture in the next years. There's many people, many responsible politicians for libraries, so it's our opportunity, Claire, to issue recommendations, because we were asking ourselves whether we can consider and even urge or demand that libraries are a minimum cultural service, fostering access to culture and the practice of culture.
So I absolutely think that libraries can and should be considered as that minimum cultural service that supports the creation and access to culture, because they meet people where they are. And we were lucky enough on Sunday to be here in Barcelona and see this happening. It's the reflection of the neighborhood. It's people's most local and accessible cultural institution. And we talk about public libraries here, but libraries are also in our schools. They're in our universities. They're in our other cultural institutions holding that memory. So I think that firstly, I would say that absolutely is a call to action, and is one that I would fully endorse. And I think it's backed up. So we've heard over the last few days, the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, she's advocating for this rights-based approach. And it's not just us saying that it's about participation. It's also the legal obligation within the human rights framework, participation in the cultural life of the community. And I think we can leverage that, and we should leverage that. It's not just about access, it's about are people there creating their opportunities to participate in cultural life? And what do libraries do better than co-creating their services and their collections. So that's one point that I think we can bring into these discussions. Other priorities, I think you just mentioned, and I think this is very important in speaking to ministries, is working cross-ministerially, cross-sectorally. And in many countries, it's different in every country. Libraries are sometimes not within the Ministry of Culture. Sometimes some libraries are and others aren't. But more than that, if we are to be pushing for our role, for culture's role, and more specifically for libraries' role in sustainable development, we need to be having these conversations outside of the library field. But also the ministers have to be. So I think really encouraging that cooperation in the spirit of what libraries do. We have so many different areas we work in, so I think they can work in many different areas too. I would also suggest, again, as we're looking at knowledge and technology policy, looking to libraries as informational professionals. They've been doing this for millennia, and this is not the first technological revolution that we've had that libraries have adapted to. So urging ministers to look to library and information professionals as a resource. And then really underlining that culture education link and education on sustainable development across the entire agenda. It can't just be informal school. It has to reach people at all stages of life. So looking to us as a resource, to our sector as a resource for that. And I think it's clear in all these areas, and maybe this is a message, a brief tagline that we can use. Investment in libraries returns in multitudes. It's not expenditure, it's investment. And if we can have these conversations, if we can bring this evidence, if we can bring really solid examples, I think we can show that investment in our sector, it helps achieve the goals. It's what's missing. It helps achieve the goals that the policymakers have already committed to.
No, it's la parte presupuestaria siempre
Yes, the budget item is always is something that we always request. In fact, one of the matters that we gathered in the video is the need to strengthen libraries in all the political instruments, and the budget allocation is one of those key issues as well. So now I would like to give the floor to Anna. We're talking about synergies and alliances which are essential so that culture and their cultural agents are key in not only cultural but also other policies. So from your experience in research of local policies and taking into consideration that more than 90% of public libraries depend on local governments, which are owned by the municipalities, which are the opportunities to position libraries in new approaches for governance, and which realms of the local policies can become allies for libraries and other cultural agents? Thank you very much, Alicia. And good afternoon to you all. I'm going to begin with a bit of a disclaimer and acknowledgement. I'm not an expert in libraries, and I'm really honored to stand here beside you because I'm learning a lot, and I'm a fan of libraries, and congratulations on what you do, and I learn a lot from this type of discussions. What I can bring on the table is the frameworks which are a bit more general or global regarding local governance, which I believe, where we believe that libraries play an important role in. Maybe I can repeat something that you're saying, the fact that more than 90% of the libraries in Spain are owned by the municipalities, and in Latin America, it's also the case. And we have the minimum service for libraries in Spain, and the ratio per inhabitant is quite high. In other words, per million inhabitants, there's many libraries. And this is really positive in order to understand the role that libraries play in education and culture. And I'm glad that you're mentioning us on the 2030 agenda, because based on our experience in local citizen governments, we could document that libraries have been key in awareness raising and sensitization among the citizens in terms of the 2030 agenda, our present and the future, and how we can contribute to co-create that future. And I would also like to mention the role of proximity that libraries boast. We have also seen that sometimes libraries are the first responders that need to cater to the basic needs of citizens at first, digital capacity building, and the hosting of migrants or accompaniment of people that suffer from social isolation. And this holistic approach is not yet so well acknowledged as we would like. And at CGLU, the institution that I represent today, we have seen in the recent times, based on the discussions that we have with our members and partner institutions, and from these research processes like the one that I am honored to coordinate on equality and care, we could identify some sort of a shift in paradigm which is relevant for this session, which is the fact that local governments are beginning to acknowledge that public services like libraries can place the reproduction of life and care at the core of public action. And we're beginning to see some actions in that line. So we believe that libraries, in that framework of putting the reproduction of life, and when I say life, I'm talking about human life and non-human life and the planet's, they place it at the core of the public action. And by doing that, we achieve stronger public policies on well-being, social cohesion, etc. I can give you a couple of examples that we have gathered in our research work, like in Gwaseon in South Korea. The municipal libraries, together with social services, identify the creatures in risk of exclusion and offer alternatives or places for socialization. I would not like to say that libraries need to exercise this role on their own. I believe it's important that they should be identified as infrastructures of accompaniment to be coupled with some other municipal services which have more competences and more legacy in that respect. But libraries can play a role in those policies. The fact that the metropolitan area of Barcelona has many libraries which are climatic refugees, climate refugees, or where people who are homeless or older people can go to the toilet, sit, read the newspaper, hold conversations. It defines the role of placing the reproduction of life at the core. And we're talking basically about rights, right to culture, right to life, and I will go back to that, right to integrity, right to mental health, right to information, especially with all those fake news and disinformation that surrounds us. I'm talking half Catalan and Spanish here, apologies. Okay, so and they show you, the algorithms show you what you want to see, basically. So what we can propose from CGLU is this care agenda that allows you to open your views and imagine different scenario. And it's not new, because if you pick the declaration of UNESCO of 82 in Mexico, it already mentions these aspects. It already cherished certain aspects which have been rendered invisible, tasks like care, looking after caregivers also, and different kinds of population, and the imaginarium, which is critical. We're talking about culture, the way in which we can fathom or imagine diverse future scenario. And the declaration talks about subjectivities, spirituality, and values, and the intellectual and emotional part that sometimes our politicians neglect because they get carried away by technocracy, productivity in their political agendas or economic growth, and they neglect these spheres or they even ban them. It has happened in the past. So I would also like to make a point. There's a warning here. I would like to talk about the digital aspect, but as an entry point to a risk that I have that we see. We see that libraries more and more encompass all the digital capacity building tasks and you need to perform many actions with the administration and bureaucratic tasks through the library. So there is a clear role, but notwithstanding, there is a caveat. And I would like to share some ideas by Abruti and Riley in Care and the City book, where they talk about the risks of embracing the digital under the smart city tags or what have you. But if it's misinterpreted, it entails risks. And they say that the neoliberal agendas and smart cities label, they can become digital incubators or digital hubs where mercantilization is prioritized over the community services, and it can serve an agenda which can be techno-urban, neoliberal, and non-caring. So, and in the expansion of services proposed by libraries, there are some risks entailed that we need to know how to navigate. Eric Lindenberg's idea is something I love. He wrote a book called Palaces of the People, and he precisely identifies libraries as a palace for the people of social infrastructures, structure of care that sustain local democracy and urban life, which can provide with alternatives in order to resist the neoliberal logic. So my proposal for this session and for libraries and for the defense of cultural rights, but going beyond that, is the agenda of care, which places the reproduction of life at the core. Really interesting, your approach and your proposal, and linking that to Asun's words. There's many good practices following that line of care, but maybe what we're missing is the perspective to put it really at the core, to place care at the core, so that it does not depend on the specific team of people working in a specific library, but rather to have a systemic approach. We are lagging behind the schedule a bit, so I would like to talk about the objective culture. It's true that CGLU has been one of the entities that has promoted this objective of culture, accompanied by IFLA, Comos, etc., and many other entities. And I would like to discuss this. You have made the exercise of thinking in terms of libraries, and I would like to talk about which are the synergies and opportunities that libraries can have in order to promote the cultural objective, and whom we could work with so that we can achieve that objective. And how could we strengthen that and the cultural sector, and not just libraries, so that this cultural objective becomes a reality? I can start by saying that we're starting from a really bad situation because culture is absent in the 2030 agenda. I was in the launching session of the culture objective where a colleague said that the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 of the natural and cultural heritage is like an accessit or a consolation prize, which defines the reality. But let me go back in time to say that in spite of the fact that many institutions fought in order to have a culture objective in the 2030 agenda approved in 2015. It was not the case, but these institutions continue to fight so that throughout this period, the multilateral institutions and governments came to realize that culture needed to play a primordial role in sustainable development. So what they did, well, the shape this took on was the culture objective. This objective is the result of a collective effort led by 8 organizations. I'm going to read the names. CGLU, well, the colleagues of the Culture Commission have participated, and I would like to acknowledge their work. IFLA, Network Culture Action, COMOS, International Federation of Coalitions for Cultural Diversity, and the International Music Council. 8 organizations leading, but throughout this process of conceptualization of the culture objectives, they have received the support of 30 global networks. The 2022 saw the initial draft in Mexico, and since Saturday we have been working more in depth in the concept, and we have established 100 objectives and indicators. We know that culture cannot be reduced to data, but knowing that data are really important in order to introduce data and figures in budgets and to have inspiring practices, or however we want to call them, and political actions, and to evaluate cultural participation, and especially who doesn't participate, and to look for alternatives, and then to measure employment and economic production and economic yield. So what we stand for with this objective is to try to find that common shared language and framework that was missing in the 2030 agenda. And from what we're seeing, it's not yielding the necessary results. And in fact, 37% of the Sustainable Development Goals are the same or even worse. And it's a de minimis agenda, and many people believe in the de minimis objectives when we are called upon to go an additional mile. Which is the role of libraries, which is what gathers us here? Well, the culture objective acknowledges really well the role to be played by libraries, together with common cultural centers as drivers for social transformation, with the bottom-up approach, which is of the utmost importance. And they're also identified as key infrastructures in order to guarantee universal cultural rights, which is what we mentioned before, not just access, participation, co-production, etc. So from the leading institutions in this initiative, we open the door so that all librarians, all libraries join this campaign. We believe that libraries are strategic allies in consolidating the credibility of this objective. We need you in order to showcase with indicators the impact in cultural rights and social cohesion of libraries and other social institutions within the cultural realm, and to integrate culture in local plans for education, cohesion, sustainability, etc. And the last point would be, why now? I've already mentioned that this is something that we have been putting on the table for a while, the role to be played by culture, but it's urgent now, because in spite of the fact that the 2030 agenda reaches up to 2030, in 2027 is the time when the framework of the post-2030 negotiations take place, and we're beginning to talk about it. And next year, the Economic and Social Committee of the UN are going to hold some conversations to reformulate it, and they're going to reformulate the Sustainable Development Committee. So the culture objective is a tool for political advocacy, and it's a tool that can help local institutions and libraries and other institutions get started and getting hands-on in order to boost the change. Let me just use this as a segue of getting hands-on to ask you one last intervention to each one, and a short one, because we would like to give the floor to the audience if you would like to intervene. And there's also a really wonderful video that we would like to show. What do we do in order to get started right now, as of tomorrow, in order to achieve that cultural objective and to achieve libraries that act as true engines or drivers, not with isolated cases, but with strong policies? One thing that needs to happen for our institution is the legal reinforcement, a legal act that sustains it. The 4 provinces that we represent, the 4 communities that we are representing in Canary Islands and Galicia, you have recent library acts. In Navarra, it's not yet the case. We're working on that. Library system and commitment to communities and strategies. If this is not sustained by a legal framework, not just with acts, but also regulations that develop that act, and an addendum on resources that would guarantee our role. It would, and I would also like for libraries to be located in some other cultural policies. We have recently published the cultural plan, and libraries are included in what it's perceived that they do, but it's not really well quoted. If there is a law on cultural rights, libraries need to take a more preponderant role. And the legal framework is not just related to libraries, but also the cultural rights. In cultural rights, libraries need to include in our strategic language the 2030 agenda, the culture objectives, and cultural rights. I have listened to a wonderful sentence today that gathers this. We listened to that in some cultural rights panel. Jorge, a researcher from Medellin, uttered that sentence. I don't remember the surname. And he said, cultural rights happen when there are opportunities. Otherwise, they are a fantasy. Libraries are an opportunity to guarantee cultural rights.
I'll be very brief because everything that has been said has been really on point. But I think going back to sort of a strategy, I think starting in the community and having the flexibility to adapt to the community's needs and coming back to not just the community, but who are the people in the community that really can benefit from the services. So I think any strategy should be flexible. It should be able to be localized. And that's really, if we can tell those stories, that can be very effective. Connecting to the strategy of the city you're in, of the region you're in terms of development, using a shared language, which is what the goal is really calling everyone to do, making our spaces be a microcosm of the future we want to see. And finally, in terms of strategy, and maybe this is preaching to the choir here, but we need to invest in our library professionals. We're asking a lot out of librarians, and the skill set is changing. So there's a lifelong learning process within the libraries, and any sort of, I think, discussions with policymakers, with setting strategy. We also need to look at how are we ensuring our library professionals are growing with the sector, but also bringing new people in. And how are we bringing people in and telling our stories and always coming back to the community?
Diana.
A ver, me quedo con 4 puntos yo
Well, a few takeaways to spark a change. First one related to the care agenda, which needs to be cross-sectional and applicable. Everything that the government does, other services, budgets, in the way they relate to citizens. And there needs to be an openness of perspective so that the different infrastructures of the city, including libraries, can transcend that practical, more immediate function. It is of the utmost importance because social infrastructures can save lives. In fact, Klinenberg gives an example of a case in Chicago a long time ago where people who were familiarized with using social infrastructures were less isolated and they suffered less risk of dying, and they died less at heat wave than the people who had less contact with social infrastructure. So I believe that's critical. Secondly, cross-sectionality. Immediately, we said it before, cultural policies should not one way and library policies the other way, but also libraries need to act as troubleshooting institutions, cultural, social, institutional, political, and environmental problems, and they need to be acknowledged as such in all public policies so that there is more coordination among the people who run the libraries and the people running education or the environmental section or in charge of other budget items. thirdly, quite briefly, we need to understand that public policies are co-produced with the citizens. To me, that's key. Citizens are not mere receivers of policies. They need to be able to co-create, co-produce them with local governments or any kind of government for that matter. And lastly, following that logic of care, how we look after the public workers, public officers, because caring or looking after someone means that we need to cater to the people looking after us with good guarantees. Those are my basic 4 points. Thank you very much to all three. You have been really inspiring. And I believe that you have been really adamant as well, because we are convinced of that job, of this work, and we have proposed some challenges or changes in perspective, and we need to roll up our sleeves and continue to toil and work, which is what we're going to do. I don't know if anyone would like to intervene. Just 2 questions.
Gracias. Bueno, yo soy Anel Nochebuena, soy
I'm
la
Anel
directora de
Nochebuena,
Cultura de Puebla, capital. Puebla es
running
una ciudad que está
culture, the cultural department in Puebla,
de la Ciudad de
which is a
México,
city
alrededor
close
de
to
una hora y
the city
media
of
de
Mexico,
Es
an hour and a half away from the city of Mexico. It's a World Heritage since 1987, and we have 3 million inhabitants, and we have 18 libraries in different parts of the city. Why do I say it? Because those libraries belong to something which is the so-called National Network of Libraries in Mexico, which is very wide and in Mexico. And there's one part of the federal government that can host or that can encompass all those libraries. And Mexico is very large and wide as a territory, so there is an important number of libraries. But in spite of the fact that we have the National Network of Libraries, owned by the national government, the different states of the Confederation cannot cope with the number of libraries. In the case of Puebla, there's more than 617 libraries in the whole state of Puebla. And it's important to take into consideration that in a territory you can have 617 libraries, and only in the capital you can find 18 libraries. What does it mean? That there is a lack of compensation. There's very few libraries. We don't have a wide municipal library that represents the size of the city, and they're not being used. People are reluctant to go to libraries. People get bored. People are more into the digital technologies, and they don't come closer to libraries. I just give you that as an example because currently the current government, we are rescuing the libraries, the 18 libraries, working with the government of Mexico in order to rescue 18 libraries that are abandoned. Books grow mold, people don't go there, libraries are closed, lack of librarians, and there are some libraries that have been open for a long time, and right now they're being used as a ballroom, something completely different. So the thing is how to entice citizens to come closer to the libraries because they're located in areas with high vulnerability. How do you make people come closer to the libraries? And there is, in addition to having a digital acqui, and in order to make young people come closer to the libraries. And we have different activities to foster reading in pivoting around the libraries or in the community. But the matter is how to make people go back to libraries. It's not like in Spain. I was living in Madrid for 13 years and I studied in Spain. And I spent my whole life at the National Library studying for my PhD dissertation in philosophy. And there were many opportunities to access libraries in Spain. It's clear in my memory, but when I went back to Mexico, the city of Mexico boasts large libraries, but as you stream away from a city of Mexico, you find precarious conditions where libraries are not important, and those accesses to culture are either closed or they have lost interest. So the question is how, from your perspective, how to make people come closer to libraries in a territory like Mexico, where clearly we're not in Spain, we're not in Europe, and culture, in spite of the fact that it's a really country, access to culture is a limited and not so broad access. We can answer really quick or with a PhD dissertation. I would like to give you some two keys that
I know we don't have
already
much time,
pointed
I'll
at.
answer really quick. I know that this is a situation faced in different parts of the world. There are different approaches. In some places, you see libraries kind of across municipalities joining together. There's pluses and minuses. It means it's further away, but they can do more in one space and then maybe go out. But I would say at the core is partnership, because there are groups within the community that want a space to meet. There are people who have an idea that, you know, they might want a community garden and there's nowhere to do it. I think the solution lies in what groups, what school groups are looking to get out of the school, what community groups, and fostering partnerships. Maybe that's partnerships with other cultural institutions, education institutions, social groups, but finding the solution in the community and then maybe changing, maybe adapting, but providing the space for that to flourish, I think is the beginning of the solution.
Y antes ha dicho Claire también, que para mí es una
And
cuestión
Claire
fundamental.
mentioned something which is something fundamental, which is professionalization, which is key. She has mentioned that without professionals, you can have a room with books or whatever, but you don't have a library if you don't have a professionals. So we need to strengthen the role of professionals that Ashton was alluding to as well. It has to do with the political context, the legal framework, but it's also the strategy of setting in motion a professional system with the responsibility that they have towards society in this service. I think we're going to see the video. I don't know if anyone else would like to make a comment. The video reminds us that libraries are culture, and we would like for you to give it love, to disseminate it. It's uploaded as part of the project. Shots. Well, it is the voices that you're going to be hearing saying libraries are this or that are people who are responsible politically for the libraries. So it is a tool of commitment, and please disseminate it.
En calquera lugar, para calquera persoa, a biblioteca é cultura.
El universo de las culturas se aloja en las bibliotecas.
Desde las bibliotecas, la comunidad.
From libraries, communities participate in culture. Libraries make culture shine. Libraries become a hug among people. Culture is done with respect. Libraries open cultural paths that help level out inequalities. Culture lives in libraries. We're talking about culture from and for everyone. It's cultural diversity for libraries. It makes culture and society advance. They are seed for culture. Libraries are proximity culture. They help us build a better world. We can expand, thanks to them, our cultural horizon. Without libraries, there is an increase in fake news and ignorance. Culture lives and has a place in libraries.
Las bibliotecas son espacios de confianza,
Libraries are
seguridad,
spaces of trust and safety for culture. They are a safe harbor for cultural diversity.
Las bibliotecas son balcones donde la cultura se
They are
asoma.
balconies where culture goes out to see the world.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias y vámonos corriendo a coger el
Thank you very
autobús que
much, and
perdemos.
we're going to take the bus because otherwise we're going to miss the concert. Thank you.